Grace Bennet had already signed her own reduction before the front doors of Blackthorn House opened, and the ink still seemed wet in her mind when the butler took her name without title and asked whether her trunk had been weighed for storage with the servant's effects. She stood on marble-worn pale at the centre by generations of shoes that had entered to be admired, married, inherited. She had entered to be employed. Her one valise pulled at her wrist, heavy not with gowns but with mending, 2 plain dresses, her father's dictionary, and a lockbox of documents she was not yet allowed to use. Behind the butler, 2 footmen looked past her as if waiting for someone else to arrive. No one else did. The housekeeper, Mrs. Cale, received her in the morning room with an account ledger already open. "You will be companion to Lady Hester until she departs for Bath," she said, tapping the line where Grace's wages had been entered in narrow strokes. "Afterward, your duties will be adjusted according to household need. You will take your tea in the schoolroom and dine at second service. Correspondence work may be assigned. You are not to receive personal callers without my knowledge." Grace removed her gloves finger by finger and laid them beside the ledger as if she were at a solicitor's desk. "My room. 3rd floor, east corridor, between the linen closet and the old nursery." Mrs. Cale closed the ledger. "You understand your position?" "I do." The words cost less than argument and bought more room. She had learned that in her mother's house and brought the lesson with her like a scar. By the end of her first fortnight at Blackthorn, the shape of each day had narrowed into a sequence so exact she could have performed it in darkness. Rise before the bell. Carry hot water up 1 flight, because the maid assigned to that corridor had weak lungs. Dress without assistance. Read to Lady Hester for 2 hours. Copy household letters in a hand deliberately plain. Mend whatever had frayed overnight. And sit down to dinner when the candles in the great dining room had already burned halfway to their sockets. Conversation passed around her, over her, through her, never to her. She was close enough to rank to know its rituals, and far enough from it to be exempt from courtesy. At breakfast on a Tuesday, Lady Hester asked for the weather report, accepted it from Grace without looking at her face, and turned to Mrs. Cale with a faint crease between her brows. "Has Mrs. Bennet answered my note regarding the extension?" "She has, my lady." "And?" "Her view remains unchanged." Lady Hester buttered her toast. "Naturally." Grace held the silver pot steady while tea filled porcelain. Nothing in her hands shook. She set each cup in place, then folded the napkin in her lap and kept her eyes on the edge of the table, where the walnut veneer had lifted slightly from years of damp and polish. Extension. Guardianship. The words never needed her present to govern her. The reply from Judith Bennet arrived at noon in a sealed packet bearing the Bennet crest, pressed into black wax, that had not quite cooled before dispatch. Mrs. Cale did not hand it to Grace directly. She left it on the escritoire where outgoing invoices were stacked, the way one might place a bill that had become tiresome but unavoidable. Grace broke the seal with a paper knife and read 3 lines written in her mother's uncompromising hand. "Return by Michaelmas. Your future is arranged. Defiance is expensive. No salutation. No signature." Judith Bennet had once said that signatures were for equals. Grace folded the note twice, then once more along the centre, and slid it into the pocket sewn into the lining of her skirt, where she kept receipts and wages stubs. She had begun that pocket at 16 after her mother locked away her allowance for speaking out of turn at dinner. Quiet preparation, hidden compartments, small methods of survival. That afternoon she copied letters in the estate office while the steward dictated from memory, pausing only to moisten his thumb and turn pages with proprietary impatience. "To Mr. Finch," he said, "regarding late rents in Lower Marrow. Kindly remit within 10 days, failing which tenancies will be reviewed. Next, to Mrs. Salter. Your daughter's place in the laundry is no longer required after quarter day. Next. Grace wrote each word in deliberate strokes, straight-backed on a chair too low for the desk. Her hand had once signed invitations to assemblies in Hanover Square. Now it reproduced dismissals she could not challenge, and notices she was forbidden to amend. When she finished, she sanded the page, shook off excess grain, and passed the sheet back for signature. The steward glanced at her script and gave a short nod of approval that sounded like concession. "Efficient," he said. "It is fortunate you are useful." Useful, not educated, not trusted. Useful like string kept in a drawer. In the corridor outside the office, two maids paused when she approached and resumed speaking only after she passed, not quietly enough. "Merchant blood, I heard. Yet she takes tea with the ladies. On wages. Then not a lady." Grace continued walking, carrying the copied letters on a tray as if they weighed nothing at all. At the turn in the passage, where no one could see her face, she pressed her thumb into the edge of the top sheet until the paper cut a clean white line into skin. The sting steadied her. Pain without spectacle had always steadied her. She had refused the marriage contract in her mother's study 6 weeks earlier, standing where afternoon light fell in bars across the carpet and made the dust look ceremonial. The contract lay open between them with two signatures already prepared by arrangement and confidence. Judith Bennet's bold hand and the careful stroke of a man Grace had met twice and trusted not at all. "You will marry Mr. Calder before the season closes," her mother had said, eyes on the document rather than on her daughter. "His shipping interests secure your position, and his family accepts the settlement terms. He asked whether my dowry could be tied to future issue before he asked whether I read music." Judith Bennet had turned one page. "Men ask practical questions. He asked whether I bruise easily." At that, her mother had looked up at last, expression unchanged, as if Grace had commented on weather. "You are 24. You are not pretty enough to negotiate for tenderness. Sign." Grace had picked up the pen, not to sign but to test the nib, and then set it down beside the inkwell with measured care. No. Silence had followed, long enough for the clock in the hall to mark 2 full minutes. Then Judith Bennet had pressed her fingertips to the contract and spoken in the same tone she used with solicitors and debtors. "Very well, if you decline protection, you decline privileges. Your trust remains under my administration until 25. You will remove yourself from my household and accept the consequences of earning your bread." Grace had gathered the single valise she had packed before entering the study, because she had known what answer she would give. She had paused only once at the door. "I accept them." She had left before permission was granted. In Blackthorn's nursery, now emptied of children and turned into a storage room for disused toys and winter draperies, Grace taught the kitchen boy his letters in 10-minute intervals between tasks. Thomas was 12, narrow as a reed, with ears that reddened when he was anxious and a concentration so fierce it made him hold his breath. She used broken chalk on the back of slate labels, saved from wine crates. "B," she said, guiding his hand with 2 fingers at the wrist. "Down, then belly again." He frowned. "It looks crooked." "It is meant to look tried. Do it again." He did, more carefully this time, and when he got it right, she nodded once, as if he had recited Latin in a drawing room. Praise was a ration in Blackthorn. She gave it where she could. On Thursdays she mended her own cuffs rather than sending them to laundry, not because the work was beneath anyone else, but because indebtedness spread quickly in a house where every favour was accounted. She re-waxed the thread, by candle stub, reinforced seams at the elbow where fabric had thinned, and turned collars so wear showed on the inside. When Mrs. Cale remarked that companions were allotted repairs from the linen room, Grace answered, "Please assign them to someone who requires them more." Mrs. Cale watched her for a beat, assessing. "You are proud." "I am careful." The housekeeper sniffed, uncertain whether she had been corrected, and moved on. At month's end, wages were distributed in envelopes by rank. Grace's contained less than agreed, docked for lamp oil and stationery she had been instructed to use for household copying. She counted the coins once, then placed 2 aside for Thomas's copybook and 1 for Mrs. Ellery in the scullery whose son had a cough that worsened at night. She did not ask for the missing amount. She did not present the contract clause Mrs. Cale had made her sign in the morning room. Asking would have required petition. Petition presumed mercy. She had seen too much of both to confuse them with justice. The next note from Judith Bennet arrived as dusk pulled long shadows across the service yard and turned the windows of the west wing to black mirrors. This one was shorter than the first, as if even language had become an indulgence. Return. I will not repeat myself. Grace stood by the narrow desk in her third-floor room, the scent of starch and cooling brick in the walls, and read the lines twice. Outside, wheels sounded on gravel. Someone important had arrived for dinner. Laughter rose from below in intermittent bursts, bright and remote. She opened her lockbox, set the note inside with the others, and closed the lid without haste. Then she sat, drew her mending basket closer, and threaded a needle in the failing light. Her fingers were steady now. She stitched a torn hem with small, exact movements, each one a refusal to be hurried back into a life arranged by someone else's boredom. Near dusk, she carried spare candles downstairs and crossed the service yard as the steward brushed past a mud-streaked undergardener. "Elias Shaw later," he said, not stopping. Elias stood by the pump, shaking. Grace filled a tin cup from the kitchen pitcher and held it out. "Drink first," she said. That night, an envelope waited on her desk, unsealed and unsigned. In elegant script, "You offered water in the yard when the house looked away. Kindness is still seen." Grace read the single line again, then turned the page over as if a name might appear only when asked twice. The paper was thick, not estate stationery, and the ink had dried cleanly without blot or hesitation. Whoever had written it had not been hurried. She held the sheet nearer the candle and saw where the downstroke on kindness leaned very slightly right, disciplined even in emphasis. Not a kitchen hand, not the steward who pressed too hard and split nibs. She folded the letter along its existing crease, set it inside her father's dictionary at the entry for witness, and closed the cover with both palms. Below stairs, second service had begun. Plates were set for those who worked in sight of gentility but did not belong to it, and conversation moved in careful channels that excluded names of guests and sums of money. Grace took her seat at the far end of the table as a maid set down cooled fish and bread too stale for the upper floor. No one refused food at Blackthorn. Waste travelled downward by rank until it disappeared. Mrs. Cale entered midway through the meal with a sheaf of folded notes, passed one to the footman, one to the laundry forewoman, and laid the last beside Grace's plate without comment. The handwriting inside was her mother's. "You have made your point. Return by month's end." Grace wiped her fingers on her napkin, folded the note once, and slid it into her sleeve. "Across from her, mister." Pike from the stables watched the movement and then looked away at once, embarrassed by having seen an intimacy that was not intimate at all. Grace finished her meal, carried her own plate to the sideboard, and climbed 3 flights in silence while laughter from the drawing room drifted through the central stairwell like music heard from the street. At dawn, she lit her own fire because the corridor coal scuttle had been emptied to save expense. Warmed water in a small kettle blackened at the base and pinned her cuffs while steam beaded on the single window. The glass looked toward the east wall and service yard, where day began as labour, before it became light. By the time the first bell rang, she had copied yesterday's unfinished notes, patched a tear at her hem, and placed Thomas's slate beside the old nursery door, where he would find it between errands. Lady Hester received her in a shawl the colour of old rose, one hand resting on a lapdog that disliked everyone equally. "Read the Parliamentary Digest, Miss Bennet," she said without greeting, and held out yesterday's paper with 2 fingers. Grace read for an hour while Lady Hester corrected her only to hear herself correct. When the lady coughed, Grace offered water before she asked. When the spaniel trembled at a dropped coal, Grace moved her chair to block the draught. No one thanked companions for accuracy or foresight. Their success was measured by the absence of complaint. In the estate office before noon, the steward dictated replies to tradesmen while pacing the rug into a darker track. Grace wrote and dried each page, then passed the finished stack to him for signature. "Not that phrase," he said, tapping one line with a blunt nail. "Replace regrettably with as instructed. It is less precise. It is less debatable." She took the sheet back, crossed out her word, and wrote his. He signed with a flourish he had not earned. When she rose to carry the letters to the dispatch tray, his voice followed her, mild and absolute. "Mrs. Bennet asks weekly whether you have reconsidered. I tell her no. Do not make me a liar." Grace did not turn. "I have not reconsidered." In the corridor outside, Thomas waited with his cap in both hands and chalk dust on his cuffs. "Miss Bennet, is this right?" He held up the slate. His B leaned and his E had too many arms. She adjusted his grip, showed him where the line began, and made him write each letter 3 times until his wrist steadied. At the end, she tore a page from her own notebook and wrote his name in large, careful print. "Keep that in your pocket," she said. "If anyone asks what you can do, show them." His ears reddened with effort and pride. "Thank you, miss. Again tomorrow." By the 2nd week of March, Blackthorn had settled around Grace like a fitted garment stitched by someone who wished to restrict breathing but permit movement enough to be useful. She was called when patience was required and dismissed when acknowledgement would have cost the caller status. She copied letters she could not send, read books she could not keep, and dined after the candles had shortened. Twice each week a note arrived from Judith Bennet, with instructions paired to command. "Return. Sign the extension. Your circumstances are temporary." Grace read every line, answered none, and stored each sheet in the lockbox under spare thread and ledger scraps. The second unsigned letter appeared 3 nights after the first, tucked beneath the mending basket she had left by the hearth, while she fetched hot water for Mrs. Ellery's son. She had not spoken of the child's cough to anyone upstairs. The note contained only 2 sentences. "You chose medicine over sleep. There are forms of rank that do not require title." Her fingers tightened around the page until the paper softened at the edge. She sat at the narrow desk, opened her writing case, and took out a blank sheet. For several breaths she listened to the house settle. A door below, wind through an eave, distant cutlery. Then she wrote, "Whoever you are, you mistake observation for permission." She sanded the line, read it once, and folded the page without sealing it. Instead of sending it, she slipped the draft beneath the false bottom of her sewing box and replaced the thimble on top. The next afternoon she crossed the service yard with a ledger for Mrs. Cale and found Elias Shaw at the pump. sleeves rolled to the forearm despite the cold. Mud streaked his coat, but his shirt cuffs were clean where they emerged from rough wool, and his hands moved with an economy that did not belong to untrained labor. He lifted a crate as she passed, then set it down exactly where the line of paving changed, as though he had measured both weight and distance by habit. When he straightened, his eyes met hers briefly. Grey, steady, unreadable. "Miss Bennet," he said. "Mr. Shaw." Nothing in the exchange suggested familiarity. Yet when she reached the kitchen door, she realized he had stepped aside before she asked, not deferentially, but with the unconscious precision of a man accustomed to making room in narrow passages for someone he had already decided to protect. That evening, Lady Hester retired early, and Grace was sent to locate a devotional volume in the West Wing Chapel for Sunday calls. The chapel had been built for family grief and public display in equal measure. White stone and dark oak, with a side aisle that smelled faintly of wax and damp hymnals. She found the requested book beneath a stack of parish reports, but another volume lay open on the rear bench, pages marked in a hand she knew, as well as her own hand. Notes in the margins from months earlier, written when she had copied sermons for Lady Hester, and argued with the text in pencil, before erasing each remark. No one should have kept that copy. Voices carried from the vestry door before she could move. "Mrs. Bennet writes again?" That was Mrs. Cale, crisp even when tired. The steward answered lower. "She demands signature by Michaelmas. Permanent extension this time. She cannot compel it here. She can make refusal expensive. Coal accounts, wages, references. She means to tighten every hinge until the girl returns." Grace stood still beside the pew, book pressed to her ribs hard enough to hurt. The steward gave a short breath that might have been amusement. "Companions always return," he said. "They are not made for uncertainty." Footsteps approached. Grace slid into the shadow between the memorial tablets and held her breath while they crossed the chapel threshold, pausing only to complain of draughts. They did not look down the side aisle. They did not see her. When they left, she remained where she was until the last echo faded, then walked out by the rear passage with the devotional volume under her arm and the other book hidden beneath her shawl. In her room she lit both candles, laid the found book on the desk, and turned to the flyleaf. No name. On the back page, however, a short line had been added in the same elegant slant as the unsigned letters. "Contradiction is not defiance when truth is at stake." She sat for a long time without removing her gloves. The house below grew quiet in layers. First the dining room, then the passage, then the yard gate. At last she opened her writing case, took out a fresh sheet and wrote, "If this is meant to frighten me, it has failed. If it is meant to direct me, it will fail also." She folded the page and added it to the others in the sewing box, unsent and carefully dated. 3 days passed before the third letter arrived. She found it at dawn on the windowsill of the old nursery, where Thomas waited for lessons. The envelope waited beneath his copybook, so it would not lift in the draft. No wax, no name. Inside, only one line. "Do not sign anything at dawn without reading the final page." Thomas looked up from his slate. "Miss, is that from your family?" Grace placed the paper face down. "It is a reminder. Will you keep it?" "Yes." She knelt beside him and guided his hand through the curve of S, then the straight stroke of T, making him repeat each letter until the word stood clear. Outside, in the yard below, she heard the pump handle creak and the measured splash of water into metal. She did not go to the window. She finished the lesson, sent Thomas to the kitchens with his copybook, and carried the letter to her room. At her desk, she opened the lockbox and set this third page on top of her mother's commands. The two hands so different, they seemed to describe opposing versions of the same world, one that governed by decree, one that watched and warned without claim. She closed the lid, turned the key and slipped it back on its ribbon beneath her collar. When the bell rang for morning tea, Grace stood, smoothed her cuffs, and went downstairs to a day arranged by others, carrying in her pocket a sentence that had altered the shape of obedience. When the bell called for morning tea, Grace crossed the upper corridor with the third unsigned warning folded inside her pocket and the key to her lockbox warm against her skin, as if metal could remember touch. Lady Hester wanted the silver warmer moved closer to the grate, the spaniel fed from a spoon, and yesterday's correspondence recited in order of inconvenience. Grace complied, measured and unobtrusive, then carried an armful of devotional books toward the chapel, because Sunday callers required the appearance of piety arranged in advance. At the foot of the chapel steps she found Mr. Shaw coming up from the lower path with mud to his knees and a slim volume in his hand, the very one she had hidden beneath her shawl 2 nights earlier, and returned to the rear shelf before dawn. He stopped 1 step below her and held out the book without flourish. "You left this where damp would reach it. I did not realize anyone else used that shelf." "Someone does." His voice was low, formal, giving nothing. Then he looked at the penciled edge where she had once written and erased her disagreements and said, "You annotate margins as if you expect to be contradicted." The morning seemed to narrow around the sentence. She heard the kitchen yard beyond the hedges, a pail striking stone, a groom's laugh, the ordinary clatter of rank and task. None of it entered the space between them. "I do," she said. He inclined his head once, not servant-like and not familiar, and moved past her up the steps to set the book inside the chapel door. When he turned back, his expression had resumed that practical stillness she had first seen at the pump. Nothing had happened that could be named. Yet Grace stood for a breath longer than necessary, fingers resting on the worn leather spine he had returned, aware that she had been recognized in the one habit she had trained herself to hide. At luncheon, she took second service as usual, ate cold game pie without complaint, and listened while the steward instructed Mr. Pike about cart repairs, in a tone he reserved for men he believed would fail. Grace folded her napkin, rose, and carried Lady Hester's tray upstairs. On the landing she passed Mrs. Cale, who handed her an envelope bearing the Bennet crest. "Your refusal has become tedious. Return by Easter week." Grace read it once in the window light, then tucked it away and entered Lady Hester's room to read aloud from a travel account no one intended to travel by. Her voice did not catch. Her hand did not shake. When Lady Hester drifted to sleep with one ringed hand resting over closed eyes, Grace set the book aside and mended a frayed cuff by the hearth, each stitch small and exact. That evening, a fresh, unsigned letter waited under the lid of her inkstand, where only someone with access to her desk would think to place it. Precision is not coldness. It is a form of mercy when chaos is profitable to others. She read the lines twice, then sat to compose another reply she would not send. "If you know so much of this house," she wrote, "then you know what speaking costs here." She paused with the pen above the page, blotted the final word, folded the sheet, and added it to the growing packet beneath the sewing box, false bottom. She did not ask who had delivered the letter. She did not ask herself why the phrase profitable to others sounded less like sympathy than strategy. By the second week of April, Blackthorn began assigning her tasks beyond Lady Hester's immediate comfort, as if invisible hands were redistributing burdens by calculation no one admitted. Mrs. Cale sent her to the orangery with inventory ledgers, because spoiled fruit and missing pots had become an embarrassment in front of guests. When Grace arrived, she found Mr. Shaw already there among citrus trees dulled by dust, sleeves rolled, sorting cracked terracotta from salvage with a care that made broken things look catalogued rather than discarded. "The list begins with stock from last quarter," she said, opening the ledger on a crate. He nodded. "Half of it is wrong." "You have reviewed accounts?" "I have eyes." She bent to count jars of grafting wax, felt him move behind her, and turned in time to see him catch a toppling shelf before it struck the glass. The force of the stop shifted his coat back from his wrist. Beneath fresh calluses, pale lines crossed the skin in two clean arcs, old and deliberate, the kind left by steel, not spade handles. He lowered the shelf as if nothing unusual had occurred and resumed sorting. "The steward reported 4 men assigned here this winter," Grace said, marking a tally. 2 left, 1 drinks, 1 steals nails." "You sound certain." "I counted the nails." When footsteps sounded in the passage, his vowels flattened at once, roughened by a county accent she had never heard when they stood alone. He called for twine in the speech of a labourer born to orders, and when the footman departed, that accent thinned again without effort. Grace kept her eyes on the ledger. She entered each figure neatly, neither questioning nor pretending she had not noticed. At dusk, she carried the completed inventory to the estate office. The steward scanned the totals, frowned, and signed the receipt with reluctant approval. "Who verified these?" "Mr. Shaw and I." The steward's mouth tightened. "The undergardener is not paid to verify books." "Then he has worked above wage." He gave her a look sharpened by annoyance and caution both. "Do not become an advocate, Miss Bennet. It distorts judgment." "My judgment remains intact." She left before he could reply and found Mr. Shaw in the yard loading empty coal sacks onto a cart. Without speaking, she set one sack straight where it had slipped, then moved on. He did not thank her. He merely touched 2 fingers to the brim of his cap, a gesture precise enough to feel less like gratitude than acknowledgement of shared discipline. 3 days later, rain began before dawn and turned the West Wing corridor into a tunnel of damp plaster and lifted paint. A section of ceiling had buckled over the old schoolroom, and Mrs. Cale dispatched Grace to supervise the mason because companions are useful where ruin must look orderly. The mason arrived late, drunk with apology, and set his ladder beneath the crack at an angle that would have sent him through the floor. Before Grace could object, Mr. Shaw stepped from the service stair carrying planks and a coil of rope. "Not there," he said to the mason. "The joist runs east." The mason bristled. "Since when do gardeners place beams?" "Since they are tired of burying fools." The words were blunt, but his tone remained calm. He shifted the ladder himself, tested each rung, then directed the work in short commands no one challenged. Grace stood beside the window with the repair ledger open, recording materials, dates, and labour hours as required. At one point, he took the quill from her to note a measurement while her hands steadied a dripping canvas. War. He held the pen between first and second fingers in a disciplined officer's grip, not the cramped fist of men unused to writing more than names. His script was spare and slanted, each numeral cut cleanly. He returned the quill at once. "Forgive the liberty, Miss Bennet." "It saved time." He met her eyes briefly. Grey, unreadable, then not unreadable at all. There was fatigue there and restraint and a practiced refusal to explain himself. He turned away before the look could become conversation. When repairs finished, Mrs. Cale inspected the patched plaster and approved the account without asking why the undergardener's initials appeared in the margin beside structural notes. Grace closed the ledger and carried it down to the study. Inside, the steward and a visiting agent from the parish vestry argued over fuel allocations, each protecting his column of numbers as if it were law. "We cannot extend credit to Lower Marrow without instruction," the agent said. "We can if we classify it as maintenance," the steward replied. "Who authorized that classification?" Grace set down the ledger and said, "The West Wing repairs required reallocation. You may list the remainder under tenant safety provisions." The agent blinked at her, then at the figures, then nodded because arithmetic had no rank when correctly done. The steward said nothing, but he did not amend her line. That night, no letter arrived, and the absence unsettled her more than any warning had. She set out her writing paper anyway, copied 2 pages from Lady Hester's dictated notes, taught Thomas the difference between N and M until his shoulders slumped with concentration, and went to bed hearing only wind at the eaves. In the morning, Mrs. Cale informed her she would accompany parish deliveries to St. Jude's Cottages because the usual clerk had influenza and you can read numbers without embellishment. A cart stood ready in the service court with sacks of flour, lamp oil, and 2 crates of books for the church school. Mr. Shaw held the horse at the head, speaking quietly until it settled. Grace climbed into the rear bench beside the ledger box. When the wheels jolted over the gate rut, one crate shifted toward the edge. He reached back, braced it one-handed, and tied the rope with a knot she had seen only once before on a naval invoice her father had kept, a hitch used when weight must not slip under sudden turn. At the first cottage, he carried sacks to the threshold and stepped back before each tenant could thank him, as if praise embarrassed him more than labour. At the second, an old woman with swollen wrists asked whether the parish might send coal this month. Grace checked the list. Her name had been crossed out without notation. "She is omitted," Grace said. Mr. Shaw looked at the page. "By whose mark?" "No initials." He took the ledger, studied the alteration, and handed it back. "Add her. The steward will contest it." "Let him." She hesitated one heartbeat, then wrote the old woman's name back into the column and adjusted totals in the margin so no arithmetic betrayed the change. Mr. Shaw lifted 2 coal sacks from the cart and placed them by the door. He neither looked to Grace for approval nor asked whether she understood what had just occurred. He had acted as if the correction were self-evident. On the return road, rain threatened, but held. The hedgerows smelled of wet earth and hawthorn. Grace kept the ledger closed on her lap and watched his profile as he walked beside the cart, rather than riding it. One hand on the side rail, gait steady even on rutted ground. He belonged to motion, to purpose, to decisions made without audience. At the south gate they were met by the steward, who demanded the delivery records before they had unloaded. "You exceeded issued coal by 2 sacks, he said, scanning the totals. Grace answered first. "Adjustment from West Wing overage." That overage was already assigned. "Then revise the assignment." The steward's gaze moved from her to Mr. Shaw and back, searching for deference in one of them and finding none he could command. He snapped the ledger shut. "Bring this to my office after supper." "As you wish," Grace said. In the corridor outside the office that evening, she paused with the ledger under her arm and heard voices from within, the steward and Mrs. Cale in low dispute. "Who keeps sending her into accounts?" Mrs. Cale asked. "Not I." "Then someone does." A chair scraped, paper shifted. The steward said, "What's Shaw? He is useful, and useful men become expensive when noticed." Grace moved before the floorboard could betray her, carrying the ledger to the dispatch shelf and signing her initials in the borrowing register. When she set down the pen, she saw another envelope waiting beneath the blotter. Unsigned, unsealed, addressed in the same elegant hand that had begun to feel like a second pulse through the days. She took it upstairs, closed her door, and read by candlelight. You were correct to add her name. Do not apologize for accuracy. Tomorrow, bring the blue ledger to the chapel steps at first bell. Grace folded the letter with deliberate care and placed it beside the others in her lockbox, then stood at the window watching the service yard darken into shape and shadow. Below, a figure crossed from stables to garden wall with measured stride, cap low, shoulders bent under ordinary weight. Nothing in the sight required belief. Nothing in it explained the handwriting that had begun to map her choices before she made them. She touched the key beneath her collar, turned from the glass, and laid the blue ledger on her desk for morning. At first, Belle Grace carried the blue ledger down the back stair, one hand on the rail, the other pressed flat over the book's warped cover so it would not slip against her skirt. The corridor lamps were still lit, their flames pale in the uncertain morning, and the chapel stones held the night's chill. Mr. Shaw waited on the lower step where the yew shadow fell across his boots, cap in hand, as if he had been standing there long enough for patience to become posture. You came, he said. You asked. She held the ledger out. He did not take it at once. His eyes moved once over the chapel door, the drive beyond, the kitchen yard to the left, where two maids crossed with empty baskets. Only when the path was clear did he open the book between them. Page 43, he said. She turned to it. Lower Marrow fuel allotments, parish supplement, widow allowances, winter reserve. 3 names had been struck through in a different ink from the steward's usual hand, and there was no notation in the margin to authorize the change. Grace had seen the pattern before in accounts meant to look tidy enough that no one asked why totals improved while people did not. These were removed after quarter day, she said. Yes. By whom? Not by a man with authority to sign it. She looked up. Then why show me and not Mrs. Cale? Because Mrs. Cale enforces instructions. You test them. The sentence landed without warmth and without insult, a fact narrowly cut. He tapped the last crossed-out entry with his forefinger. Mrs. Turner, he said. Her husband kept the south wall standing the winter the frost split it. She has 2 grown daughters, and 1 room with a broken hearthstone. If she misses 1 delivery, she burns furniture. Grace traced the name with her gaze, as if looking harder might restore ink. I can amend the line. You can. He closed the ledger. You will then be asked who gave you standing to do it. And what answer do you recommend, Mr. Shaw? That you read the figures. They stood in silence as the first carriage of the day rolled over gravel beyond the hedge. When he handed the ledger back, his fingers brushed the edge of the page, steady and calloused, and she noticed again the old pale arcs crossing his wrist beneath fresh labour marks. Not ornamental scars, survived ones. I have no wish to worsen your position, she said quietly. He put on his cap. Then do not let them teach you to ignore subtraction when it has faces. He left by the side path before she could frame another question. She watched him cross the yard with the measured stride of a man who carried instruction as if he expected to be obeyed, and then remembered, at the last instant, that he wore a gardener's coat. By noon she had copied 4 letters for Lady Hester, corrected 2 invoices, and signed for lamp oil she was forbidden to expense without countersignature. At second service she ate quickly, excused herself with the ledger under her arm, and entered the estate office while the steward argued with a carrier about axle repairs. Grace set the book down on the side table, opened to page 43, and drew a neat line through the strike marks. She restored all 3 names and adjusted the totals in the margin, so the numbers held. When she turned, the steward had stopped speaking. What have you done? He asked. Corrected an omission. On whose authority? On arithmetic. His expression did not change, but the knuckles around his quill whitened. Those lines were removed for budgetary discipline. Then budgetary discipline can be found elsewhere. You are paid to copy, Miss Bennet, not to distribute relief. She met his gaze and set the sandshaker down with care. Then deduct the cost from my wages. The carrier looked from one to the other with open discomfort. The steward inhaled through his nose, clipped and controlled. As you wish, he said at last, because a scene before tradesmen cost more than 2 sacks of coal. She left with the ledger and felt his stare between her shoulder blades until the corridor turned. That evening she unlocked her trunk, lifted the false board, and took out the bracelet she had kept when every other ornament from her London trousseau had been sold, gifted, or left behind. Garnets set in old gold, unfashionable now, too dark for spring assemblies, too expensive for a companion's wrist. Her father had bought it the year she turned 18 because she had admired it once in a Bond Street window, and then forgotten to mention it again. She had not worn it since coming to Blackthorn. She had kept it because memory was one form of solvency no one could audit. At dusk she asked Mrs. Cale for leave to fetch additional writing paper from the village stationer. Mrs. Cale granted 20 minutes and reminded her that companionship did not include evening strolls. Grace nodded, took a plain shawl, and walked quickly down the lane to Market Cross, where the pawnbroker kept late hours for men who preferred their transactions unobserved. The shop smelled of metal dust and old wool. A bell rang once as she entered. The proprietor peered at her over spectacles clouded at the edges. "Miss?" "I require immediate cash," she said, laying the bracelet on green baize. "No receipt in family name." He tested a stone, weighed the piece, named a number insulting enough to be strategic. "It is worth twice that," she said. "It may be in London." She did not haggle again. Every minute she spent arguing was one less before the coal yard closed. Very well. He counted coin into her glove, wrapped the bracelet, and slid it into a drawer without ceremony. Grace closed her fingers over the money until the rims marked crescents into her palm, then crossed 2 streets to Barlow and Sons Fuel Merchants and requested immediate delivery to 6 cottages in Lower Marrow, including Mrs. Turner's, paid in full, no sender listed. The clerk blinked when she produced notes and silver from a companion's purse. "You are certain of the quantity?" "Yes." "Name for the book?" She thought of refusals, of commands unsigned because signatures were for equals, of crossed-out lines that translated to cold floors and wet blankets. "Enter it as private credit." He shrugged and wrote. His hand was blunt and blocky, nothing like the slanted script that found her desk after difficult days. She watched each address copied from her folded list, checked every line and waited until the yard foreman shouted for carts to load before she stepped back into the evening. Halfway to Blackthorn, she saw Mr. Shaw across the road near the cooper's yard, speaking with a Wainwright over wheel spokes stacked against a wall. He did not call out. She did not alter her pace. If he recognized her beneath the plain shawl and lowered brim, he gave no sign. She reached the side gate 2 minutes before her leave expired and returned to Lady Hester's sitting room with a bundle of stationery in hand, as if that had been the purpose of the errand. No letter appeared that night. Grace lay awake listening to rain tick against the eaves and told herself she did not expect one. By the next afternoon, smoke rose from every chimney in Lower Marrow. She saw it from the hill above the church when she was sent with parish notices and a basket of tinctures for the infirm. 6 thin plumes, then a 7th from the Turner cottage, wavering but unmistakable against the winter sky. At the vestry table she signed the delivery register, and, when the curate left the room to fetch seals, glanced at the district fuel ledger open beside the inkstand. Beneath emergency disbursement, a new line had been entered in disciplined, right-leaning script she knew at once. Anonymous credit posted against winter deficiency. Cleared in full. The strokes were exact, the pressure even, the tail of each Y cut short as if the writer disliked ornament. Her breath stalled for one count, then resumed. She closed the register, finished her rounds, and returned to Blackthorn before dark with mud at her hem and a steadiness in her spine that felt like borrowed steel. 3 days later, with frost whitening the service court and the house preparing for a dinner no one below stairs would taste, Grace carried the West Wing repair ledger to the study for filing. The corridor outside was empty. Inside, voices moved through the half-closed door, low but distinct in the hush between courses. The steward spoke first. The extra coal reached all 6 cottages. Someone paid. Mrs. Cale answered, brisk as knife work. Then removed the deduction from the quarter report. A paper rustled. Another voice followed, unfamiliar male, carrying the clipped cadence of a London clerk reading from dictation. There is also this from Mrs. Judith Bennet, delivered this morning. Grace stopped with her hand on the ledger clasp. Read it, the steward said. The clerk cleared his throat. You will continue pressure by practical means. Miss Bennet romanticizes deprivation when insulated from it. Remove discretionary comforts among those to whom she has grown sentimentally attached. She returns when the consequences of disobedience are visible. If she inquires, remind her that charity without governance is vanity. Silence stretched 1 beat, 2. Mrs. Cale said, She writes as if this house were hers. It is hers where money reaches, the steward replied, and she is not wrong. Miss Bennet interferes without comprehension. The clerk turned a page. Her father mistook stubbornness for character. Do not repeat his error. Grace did not feel the ledger slipping until its metal corner struck the skirting with a muted knock. Inside the study, chairs scraped. Who is there? The steward called. She bent, lifted the ledger, and stepped into the doorway before he could come out. It is only I. The West Wing accounts. Mrs. Cale's eyes narrowed at her face, searching for evidence of what she had heard. Grace kept her gaze on the filing cabinet beyond them. Leave it, the housekeeper said. Grace set the ledger down on the nearest table. The clerk from London, narrow-shouldered in city black, looked at her with the blank curiosity of a man who delivered words and never lived where they landed. On the desk lay the opened letter, Judith Bennet's hand unmistakable even upside down. Grace did not look at it twice. Anything further, Miss Bennet? The steward asked. No. She left with measured steps, closed the door behind her, and crossed the passage to the linen room before her knees had the opportunity to decide whether they would hold. In the dim between stacked sheets and camphor chests, she set both palms against the shelf edge and counted her breaths, while a tremor worked through her fingers so finely that the brass key at her throat tapped once, then once again against bone. Not misunderstanding. Design. She straightened, smoothed her cuffs, and carried folded napkins to the dining room as requested. Through first course, she poured claret for guests who discussed hunting leases and piano tutors, her face composed, her hands obedient except when porcelain met silver and gave a brief, bright ring. No one remarked upon it. No one asked why colour had drained from her mouth. After second service, she went upstairs, closed her door, and opened the lockbox. Her mother's notes lay stacked in command order. Return by Michaelmas. Your future is arranged. Defiance is expensive. She placed tonight's knowledge among them without paper, a fact inserted like a blade. Then she reached beneath the sewing box false bottom and drew out the unsent drafts written over months to a hand she could not name, and had begun, against discipline, to trust. Whoever you are, you mistake observation for permission. If this is meant to direct me, it will fail also. Speaking costs here. She added a fresh sheet, dipped her pen, and waited until the ink steadied at the nib. Tonight, I learned the cost was set deliberately, she wrote. Not by weather, not by poor harvest, by choice. Her hand paused only once when a footstep sounded in the corridor and moved on. She finished the line, sanded it, and folded the page into the packet without sealing it. By the second week of March, she had learned that humiliation could be administered by correspondence as efficiently as by voice, and that knowledge sat under the breastbone like swallowed iron. She undressed by candlelight, folded her dress over the chair back, and stood at the window looking down into the service yard. Near the pump, a man in a gardener's coat checked the lock on the tool shed and turned toward the dark orchard wall, with that same unhurried military economy she had no longer any wish to explain away. In the morning she would copy letters again. She would read aloud, mend cuffs, account for other people's comfort, and answer commands in a voice that did not waver. But as she extinguished the candle and lay in the narrow bed with the key ribbon twisted once around her fingers, one decision settled with perfect clarity. She would not return to a hand that mistook suffering for instruction. She lay still for 3 breaths after the candle went out, listening to the boards settle and the wind move along the eaves, and then she sat up again with decision already formed, as clean and cold as the basin water on her washstand. The ribbon key had left a shallow mark across her fingers. She untwisted it, struck a match, and lit the candle once more. Her room looked smaller in that light, reduced to function. Narrow bed, cracked pitcher, mending basket, trunk, desk. A life arranged for temporary obedience. She crossed to the trunk, lifted the false board, and drew out the valise she had brought from London, the same one she had carried through Blackthorn's front doors when she still believed endurance might buy negotiation. She packed without hurry and without sentiment. 2 plain dresses. Stockings rolled tight. Her father's dictionary with the first letter hidden at witness. The packet of unsent drafts from the sewing box. The lockbox papers and her mother's notes, because evidence belonged in daylight, not in memory. When she opened the lockbox compartment beneath the notes, her fingertips found the last of her wages, thinned by deductions she had never contested. She left half on the desk beside a folded line for Thomas. 4 copybooks. Keep practicing your hand. The cost of leaving should not be paid by a boy learning letters in stolen minutes. Before the house clock struck midnight, she had unpinned the companion's badge from her collar, laid it beside Mrs. Cale's account slate, and tied her bonnet ribbon under her chin with fingers that no longer trembled. The 3rd-floor corridor was unlit. She moved by familiarity, one hand on plaster, valise held close so its clasp would not knock the wall. At the stair turn, she paused to listen. No steps below. No voices from the drawing room now, only the distant clink of silver being tallied in the pantry. She took the back stairs down past the schoolroom and the old nursery, crossed the passage behind the morning room, and reached the study door. It was locked, as she had expected. On the wall to the right hung the ring of office keys, arranged by size and laziness. She selected the narrow brass one with a filed tooth, inserted it, and felt resistance. Then release. The study smelled of sealing wax, damp wool, and ledger dust. Moonlight struck the edge of the central desk and left the cabinets in shadow. Grace set her candle down, opened the filing drawer marked Trust Administration, and began removing packets in date order. Estate deeds, tenant bonds, Lady Hester's annuity schedules. At the back, beneath a tied bundle of dormant accounts, she found what she had come for. a flat envelope sealed in dark wax with her father's signet, and written in a hand she had not seen in years. For Grace Elizabeth Bennet to be opened at her 25th year in the presence of co-trustee. Her birthday was in 9 days. She stood very still, envelope in both hands, and remembered her father at the breakfast table showing her how to check columns twice before signing once. Precision is respect, he had said. For numbers, yes. For people, more. A floorboard sounded in the corridor. She pinched the candle wick between wetted fingers, took the envelope and her valise, and slipped out, relocking the door behind her by touch. The footstep passed toward the front hall without turning into her passage. She waited in darkness until the sound faded, then moved again, this time across the service court where frost made the stones shine dull and hard under starlight. Mr. Shaw's office sat beyond the tool shed, a narrow room attached to the old glass house and usually bolted by dusk. She had never crossed to it at this hour. She crossed now. The door was shut. Light showed under it, a thin line across the threshold. She knocked once. Silence. Then a chair scraped inside. The bolt drew back. Elias Shaw opened the door in shirt sleeves with gardener's gloves tucked through his belt and a pen still in his hand. He looked first at her face, then at the valise, then at the sealed packet she carried against her coat. His expression altered by a degree so slight it might have been missed by anyone who had not spent a year studying restraint. "Miss Bennet," he said, "what has happened?" "She intends to force signature at dawn," Grace answered. "I will not be in this house when that hour arrives." His gaze moved once to the dark court behind her, assessing. "Come inside." She stepped in. He closed the door and set the bolt without noise. The room was warmer than the corridor, heated by a small iron stove. Shelves held seed ledgers, parish maps, and estate repair books stacked with military order. On the table lay an open account register, 2 sharpened nibs, and a cup gone cold. A gardener's office if one looked quickly, not if one looked twice. Grace set her valise on the chair and placed the sealed envelope on the table between them. "This was in the trust drawer," she said, "addressed to me for my 25th year, in the presence of co-trustee." He did not touch the envelope yet. "You have not opened it. It is sealed. And you have honored that." She met his eyes. Grey, steady, no longer unreadable, only guarded. "I came because there is one door in Blackthorn I believed might open." For the first time that night he smiled, not broadly, but enough to transform the severity of his face into something warmer and unexpectedly young. Then he removed the gloves from his belt and set them aside with deliberate care, as if laying down part of a costume that had done its work. "When did you decide?" he asked. "An hour ago, perhaps a year ago. Tonight, I merely acted." He inclined his head once, acknowledgement rather than praise. "You cannot return to your room now. Mrs. Cale will have found your note by first light." "I know." "You understand what leaving costs?" "Yes." A pause settled, not empty but weighted. The stove ticked softly. Somewhere in the yard a horse stamped in its stall. Grace drew breath, steadied it, and pushed the envelope half an inch toward him. "The packet names a co-trustee. If that person is in this house, I request his presence now. If he is not, I request carriage to the magistrate before dawn, and witness that I departed under coercion." He looked at the envelope, then at her, and when he spoke his voice had shifted into a register she had heard only in fragments, educated vowels no longer flattened for anyone's comfort. "I am Elias Ashford, Earl of Renford, and the co-trustee your father named in secret." The sentence was quiet. It did not rise. It did not ask belief. It simply settled into the room and reordered every unexplained detail of the past year. She did not move at once. Her hand remained on the table edge, knuckles pale. Under Gardner, requisition authority, the disciplined pen grip, the sword scars hidden under callus, the ledger entries no steward had authorized, the unsigned letters that had watched conduct rather than ornament. What Grace did not know, what no one in Blackthorn had known, was now standing 2 feet away with a pen in his hand and mud still on his boots. He continued just as quietly. I left the letters unsigned so your answer would belong to you, not to my name. Her pulse struck once, hard, then steadied. She heard herself ask, How long have you been at Blackthorn? 18 months. Before I arrived. Yes. By arrangement with my father. By instruction in his final codicil. I was to observe trust administration without declaring authority unless mismanagement became coercion. She swallowed. And tonight qualifies. It does. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, hanging by the stove, took out a signet ring and set it beside the sealed envelope. The crest matched the one on old correspondence she had copied in the office and never been permitted to file under his true name. She did not need more proof. Outside, the first paling of dawn had not yet touched the window, but the night had shifted toward it. What happens now, my lord? She asked, title formal, voice level. His eyes held hers. Now you open your packet. Then we go to the magistrate with originals, not copies. By noon, Mrs. Bennet's extension petition will be stayed. He broke the wax only after she nodded permission. Inside were 3 pages in her father's hand, a notarized codicil, and an addendum bearing 2 signatures, her father's and Elias Ashford's, dated 2 years before the funeral. The codicil transferred full authority to Grace at 25 and granted immediate emergency review if evidence of coercive deprivation could be shown against beneficiaries or dependent tenants. Her mother's notes, the altered ledgers, and the London clerk's letter were no longer grievances. They were exhibits. Grace read each line once, then again, lips pressed thin with concentration. She did not cry. Something harder than tears formed inside her. Not anger now, but structure. When she finished, she stacked the documents square, slid them back into the envelope and tied the packet with the blue ribbon from her key. Then she looked up. I will submit everything, she said. My mother's notes, the crossed-out coal names, the instruction letter from tonight. I will not negotiate in private. Good. She will say I am emotional, impressionable. Then let records answer. A near smile touched her mouth, brief as a match flare. As you wish, my lord. He shook his head once. Not tonight. She waited. Grace, he said, the formality dropping by a single careful degree. You have directed yourself for a year under pressure designed to break you. No one will call that impressionable in my hearing. The words landed more deeply than reassurance had any right to do. Recognition, clean and unsentimental. She placed her palm flat on the sealed packet as if claiming weight and future at once. In the lane beyond the glass house, a cart rattled toward the kitchens. Day staff beginning their circuits. The house would wake soon and discover absence. Elias lifted her valise as if it weighed little, though he did not move toward the door until she rose and stood beside him by choice. He drew the bolt back and opened the office into the last dark minutes before dawn, not closing her in, not directing her step, simply making way. Grace crossed the threshold first, documents secured under her arm, and walked toward the gate where the road to the magistrate ran east. Gravel ground under her boots as she and Elias crossed the east gate, and the cold before dawn entered her sleeves like water. A covered carriage waited in the lane without crest or lantern flare, the driver wrapped in plain wool. Elias handed up her valise, then offered his arm without insistence. She took it because the step was high, not because she was uncertain, and settled opposite him with the packet on her lap and both hands over it. Neither spoke while Blackthorn fell behind them. The wheels found ruts, rose, steadied. At the first turn, the house disappeared behind bare elms, and Grace felt the last of the night inside her chest loosen by a degree. Elias broke the silence only when the road widened toward town. At the magistrate's office, you will be asked whether you came under pressure from me. I will answer no. They will ask whether I concealed identity for advantage. You did, she said, then met his gaze. To protect legal process, not to force consent. His mouth moved once, almost a smile. That distinction will matter. It already does. By the time they reached the borough court, morning had begun in slate light. The clerk on duty looked up with polite fatigue that sharpened into alertness when Elias placed his signet ring on the counter beside the sealed packet and gave his name in full. Within minutes, a private chamber became a hearing room. One coal fire, one long table, 2 inkstands, and enough chairs for witnesses who preferred not to be seen arriving. At 9:30, Judith Bennet entered in travelling silk the colour of steel and removed her gloves finger by finger before she looked at Grace. Her expression did not alter. She had expected resistance. She had not expected formality with records. Grace, she said, as if greeting a guest delayed by weather. You have dramatized a domestic matter. Grace stood. It is a trust matter. Judith's eyes moved to Elias. And this is? Elias Ashford, Earl of Renford, the magistrate said before he could answer, consulting the document already before him. Named co-trustee in Mr. Bennet's codicil. For the first time, Judith went still in a way that was not composure, but recalculation. The hearing began without ceremony. The magistrate asked direct questions. Grace replied in the same measured tone she had used for a year while reading letters she could not sign. She submitted her mother's notes first, each command dated and preserved. She submitted the blue ledger next, open to page 43, strike marks and restorations visible in 2 inks. She submitted copies of wage envelopes showing repeated deductions for required materials. Elias provided the codicil and the emergency clause, then a sworn statement of covert observation under trustee duty. When the clerk set his affidavit before Grace for verification, she glanced down and saw his signature in full. Elias Ashford Renford. The right-leaning slant, the restrained tails on the Y, the disciplined pressure on each downstroke. The hand that had written, "You offered water in the yard," when the house looked away. She had recognized fragments for months. Now, she recognized certainty. Her pulse lifted, then settled as she nodded to the clerk and returned the page. By 11, the room had filled with the people the numbers had touched. The parish vestry agent arrived with fuel records. The Barlow clerk came with the merchant book and confirmed a private credit posted in Grace's amount and hand. Then, matched by anonymous clearance, entered the following day in a script he could identify but had never named. Mrs. Cale appeared under summons, spine straight, and admitted that instructions regarding practical pressure had come from London correspondents tied to Judith Bennet's office. The London clerk himself, pale and exact, produced his dispatch copy when asked and confirmed he had read the same lines aloud at Blackthorn. The steward entered last, eyes tired and guarded. He answered reluctantly at first, then with brisk precision once the magistrate warned him against omission. Yes, he had marked out tenant names under instruction to reduce discretionary outlay. Yes, he had reported Grace's refusals weekly to Mrs. Bennet's office. Yes, he had told Mrs. Cale to watch Shaw because useful men became expensive when noticed. He looked once toward Elias and added after a beat, "I did not know his title. I knew his accounts were correct." "What of Miss Bennet's administrative capacity?" the magistrate asked. The steward's jaw tightened. "Her figures were consistently correct." Judith spoke then, bored tone intact. "My daughter has always mistaken opposition for principle. I preserved her future." Grace did not raise her voice. "You reduced coal to widows to compel signature. I managed assets. You weaponized them." The magistrate lifted a hand before Judith could answer, and read from the codicil again, slower this time, then from his own interim authority. When he finished, his ruling was brief and final. Permanent guardianship extension denied and voided. Existing administration by Judith Bennett suspended pending full review. Interim control of trust disbursement and tenant contracts. Granted immediately to Grace Bennett under co-trustee oversight until her birthday, then sole authority as stipulated. Household allowances drawn through the trust, including Judith's discretionary account, frozen pending audit of coercive misuse. Judith's face did not crack. It hardened by refinement. She replaced her gloves and stood. "You mistake a procedural victory for independence," she said. Grace held her gaze. Noted. 4 words. Nothing more. Judith left without looking back. The London clerk gathered his papers and followed. Mrs. Cale remained long enough to sign her deposition, then turned to Grace at the door. "I did what the house required," she said. "You did," Grace replied. "And now the house requires accuracy." Mrs. Cale gave one short nod, neither apology nor defiance, and went. By early afternoon they were back at Blackthorn, not through the service gate but the front drive. Word had arrived before them. The butler, who had once taken Grace's name without title, opened the doors himself and said, "Miss Bennett," with full address and no hesitation. In the morning room the long table had been cleared. Ledgers, payroll books, and tenant contracts were stacked in ordered columns. The same polished surface where she had poured tea, while others decided her life now waited for her signature. Staff stood along the walls by rank and habit. Mrs. Cale near the mantel, the steward beside the dispatch tray, Mr. Pike from stables at the rear, Thomas in a borrowed clean collar with his copybook clutched to his chest. Grace removed her gloves and sat at the table head. Elias stood to her right, not seated, not speaking, unless asked. "First," she said, opening the wages ledger, "all improper deductions from required household supplies will be reversed and repaid this quarter. Missed amounts to current and former staff will be entered by name." She looked to the steward. "Can this be done today?" "It can," he said. "Do it." She moved to tenant accounts, restoring each struck name with the same neat hand that had copied dismissals for others. Mrs. Turner, Salter, Finch. She authorized winter reserve release under safety provision and required dual sign verification on future removals. She submitted a written request for parish cosign to prevent one-office alteration. She entered Thomas Bennett, not kin, only coincidence of name, in the school stipend line for copybooks and evening instruction, then looked up at him. "You will keep practicing your hand," she said. His ears went red. "Yes, miss." "Call me Miss Bennett for now. We will renegotiate titles when your spelling improves." A faint laugh moved through the room, dry and brief, the first warmth Blackthorn had permitted itself in months. She signed each order in full. Grace Elizabeth Bennett. No borrowed initials, no dictated script. When the final page was blotted and sanded, she closed the ledger and placed it in the completed stack. The steward took it with both hands, as one receives law or consequence. As the room emptied, Mr. Pike paused at the door. He had once watched her fold her mother's note at second service and looked away from embarrassment. Now he said, without flourish, "My sister is in Lower Marrow." The coal reached in time. He touched 2 fingers to his brow and left before she could answer. Mrs. Cale was last. She set the companion's badge on the table, the one Grace had left by the slate at midnight. "This was found on my accounts," the housekeeper said. "It is no longer needed." Mrs. Cale's gaze shifted once toward Elias, then back. Whatever conclusion she had drawn from his measured silences, she did not share it. "No," she said, "it is not." When the door closed, quiet settled over the room in layers. Distant pans in the kitchens, a cart in the yard, the slow tick of the mantel clock. Grace gathered the remaining personal papers into 2 piles. In one she placed her mother's commands, the hearing transcript copy, and the codicil duplicate for secure filing. In the other she placed the unsigned letters and the packet of unsent drafts from her sewing box. Elias waited. She touched the top letter, then looked at him. "In the chapel book, in the margin, that line about contradiction." "Yes." "In the nursery, under a copybook." "Yes." "In my inkstand, under my own hand." His expression softened by a degree. "I had help once from Thomas, who believed he was delivering arithmetic notes. After that, I used keys." She let out a breath that might have become a laugh in another life. "He never asked questions." "He is discreet." "So are you." A pause, then she lifted the packet of unsent drafts. "These were my replies. I never sent them because I would not answer a phantom." He accepted the pages but did not open them. "Do you regret that?" "No. They kept my judgment clear." "Good." She rose from the chair. The room felt different now, only because she stood in it differently. Not employed at its margins, but centered by record and choice. Elias set her valise by the wall, then extended his hand, open and patient, the same way he had opened the office door before dawn. No pressure, no claim. Grace looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had watched without owning, intervened without display, and finally spoken when silence would have become harm. Then she placed her hand in his. "On one condition," she said. "Name it." "No more unsigned letters." He smiled, and it transformed his face from guarded severity to unhidden warmth. "Agreed." Outside, the late light crossed the windows and reached the table where her name had dried in ink, line after line, undeniable. Inside, she did not let go.